to be indigenous or African or anything other than white is inherently inferior, has really been pushed largely on the Mexican people and largely on the Latino people in California, right? There's this idea that if you had any, indigenous ancestry, it's kind of poisoning your line. A lot of our people, most of our people, from what even at universities, right? They thought they were just from Spain, right? Extensions of Europe. And to me, that was heartbreaking. And I wanted to show the world that that was not the case.
Hi, I'm Danielle Romero. Thank you so much for being with me here on my channel where we talk about American identity and family stories. And I love bringing people on for conversations about their identity journey, their story of reconnecting with their heritage, their ancestry. And I think what is so incredible about these conversations, I feel so honored to be trusted with people's words like this, is that even if our heritage is not the same, even if it's not, your heritage is not going to be the same as the person on the other side of the screen, a lot of times the journey and the reconnecting journey, there are so many similar experiences. And I just love how it brings us all together. So I'm really excited to bring a new friend on, Gabriel. And he actually has a YouTube channel, and I'll put it up on here so you can follow him. And he has been on quite a journey. He was adopted. He's been reconnecting with his biological ancestry, which is indigenous ancestry. And I wanted to bring him on because he did a video talking about, are Mexicans Native American or something like that. And this is something that if you've been on the channel, I have wrestled with. What is Mexican? Indigenous? Are they the same thing? How do we work through this in a post-colonial world? So if you'd like to watch this ad-free off of YouTube and support the work I'm doing, I'd love to have you join me at patreon.com/NYTN. Otherwise, let's go welcome Gabriel on.
Okay. My name is Gabriel Clark-Faust. I consider myself indigenous. I'm indigenous from the Yoreme people of Sinaloa and also the Chichimeca groups of Guanajuato, Zacatecas.
Awesome. And I was watching a lot of your stuff and I heard a little bit about your story, but I'd love for you to share it on here because you've been reconnecting.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are reconnecting for different reasons. Different things happen. Can you tell me about your story of reconnecting to your indigenous heritage, like the difference between how you grew up and maybe where you are right now with that?
Yeah, so I have a very, I guess you could say, controversial opinion about that. Um, Starting with my backstory, I'll go up to that first. I grew up in the Bay Area. I was raised and adopted by two men in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I learned a lot about where I was from one of the people who adopted me. Their both name was Richard Clark, Richard Faust, and they taught me about my indigenous heritage to an extent. As I started getting more into it, one of my adoptive fathers is more kind of pushing me away from it because I think they saw it as something that was, um, I guess, against what they believed because they grew up very conservative. Even being like I guess, a homosexual man, he still had his own prejudice against indigenous people. And me growing up, I heard certain things like, don't be a wetback, don't be, a beaner, don't be a drunken Indian, right? And this was coming from one of my parents, not both of them. The other one was a lot more accepting and a lot more, trying to influence me and my brother to be proud of who we were. He understood that. But yeah, that's, and with that, it kind of grew curiosity in me because I was curious of, so why is it, what's wrong with being native? And what's wrong with being Mexican? And where, and learning about my indigeneity and then learning about my Mexican roots, I've been able to kind of deconstruct and decolonize and learn that there are gray zones where they, I guess, interconnect. And that really fascinates me because, you know, kind of going back into my, trying to reconnect with my own people, being in more Mexican spaces, quote unquote, and more Latino spaces, a lot of, they too are kind of in this I guess, kind of weird identity space. It's not just because I was adopted. It was also because, a lot of them, with the circumstances of colonization and our history, you know, it's left our people lost to who they really are.
When I took my first DNA test, it was 23andMe, and it was a long time ago. And you would get the test in 3 parts. So they would like give you your haplogroup, which I don't know if you've taken one or gotten that, but my haplogroup was C1C, which is indigenous to the Americas. I was like, okay.
Yeah.
So then I get my results, and it was like, congratulations, you're mostly from these 3 ethnicities. It was Italian, Irish, and Mexican. I was like, Mexican is not, that's like not an ethnicity. Like, how can you be
Yeah.
Mexican? Like, I'm not, I'm American from New York. And so like it was, I started like kind of delving in. So I feel like the work I've been doing is kind of like peeking under the lid of like what is
Yeah.
white. And I feel like you've been doing that with Mexican. Like, what is Mexican standing for? And what is it really? Because it's not getting used
And,
right.
you know, the idea of Mexican has been very racialized, right? But in reality, from my research, being a Mexican person, it's a nationality, right? It's like being an American. Anyone of
Right.
any race can be an American. You can be Middle Eastern, Asian, African, etc. It's if you have a citizenship to Mexico, right, you are a Mexican. But due to the circumstances of colonization and nationalism, right, it's been racialized, right? And I would put it under a tier of what I like to call de-Indianization, right? Anthropologist Guillermo Bonfil Botaya, he wrote a book that is really good. I recommend it. It's called Mexico Profundo, and it's about how essentially Mexico has this problem with their own identity. They are, the root of who they are is indigenous, but because of colonization, they're trying to aspire to be something they can never really truly be, which is, a colonial identity. And this de-Indianization and this detribalization took, its face is shown in many ways, but mainly it's through, again, this racialization of nationalism with the Mexican identity. But it's not unique to just Mexico. It's also, you can see it with Peru, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, Costa Rica. I would argue the majority of quote unquote Latin America is under the same type of de-Indianization, detribalization process. And again, this is just my take. This is a take from my own studies and research. Take of it as you will. But when I hear about these things, when I see the receipts of our history, you can't deny what it is. You can't deny that our people were, you know, with the circumstances of colonization, they were given these labels, as basically to swap out their indigenous identity with these Eurocentric identities. And for me, my work is dedicated to shedding a light on that. That's important to me
That's
because
so good.
I can't see when I see my people and I see that they're in this lost state of denying their own indigeneity, right? Their own, dark skin, their indigenous features, and they call themselves Hispanic, Latino, Latinx. I have no problem with the X and Latinx. It's the Latin part that I have a problem with because it's Eurocentric in nature. Same thing with Hispanic.
Like when I started doing my family research, I was trying to figure out where the indigenous line come in. Like where is this? And a lot of family that went through the missions were labeled as coyotes, which is like
Yeah,
is
I've
that
heard
like
of that.
a Nahuatl word or something? And I had to write it down before I went in. But it's a term used where it's like you had an Indio person marrying someone that was half Indio, half Spanish, and like now the child gets a new special name. I feel like to your modern senses, to see the way all of the different categorizations on your steps to becoming white, you know?
Exactly. And that caste system, the casta system, especially in Mexico, is like it's still around. It's evolved, I would say. Uh, like you said, the more white you were, right, the more European ancestry you had, the more privileges you'd have. You could have certain titles in government, right? You'd have more respect in society and social settings. And it gets pretty like on point. Like yeah, at the very top you have criollos, those who were Europeans, born in Spain, right? And then below that you have peninsulares, which were Europeans that were born in Mexico. Below that you had your castizo. Castizo was someone who was 3/4 European, 1/4 Native American ancestry, right? And then below that you had Harnizo, right? Harnizo was someone who was 40% indigenous. I mean, they really went down to a T with these things. And it goes on. It goes on and on. I've researched all of this for a while now, and it's really shocking just how much, a lot of people think that I hear this a lot in the community itself with the Chicano Mexicans. They say, "Oh, yeah, well, we're not obsessed with race," and I hear that, and I think to myself, I think that there is still prevalent racism all around all in Mexico and in the social systems of a lot of Chicanos and Mexicans. I lived in Mexico for a time, probably about a year and a half, and I saw it. To be called Indio is like being like something dirty, you know, Indio feo or all these different terms that are just trying to like demonize anything regarding indigeneity, looking indigenous, being indigenous, practicing anything indigenous. And it's just tragic to watch our own people be in this position where such a large portion of their identity and heritage is being demonized by themselves because of the circumstances of this colonization that is just in their head.
I have indigenous heritage, but I would never call myself indigenous because I don't have a
Okay.
connection to it because we lost that. Like we have food traditions, like my family made tamales with the metate imano. We still have it in the family. It's like hundreds of years old. It came from what is now Mexico. We have it now in
Yep.
Louisiana. But I didn't grow up with that knowledge. I didn't grow up with that. And it's not a predominant amount. And I attention of rejecting blood quantum because that's like this is not a huge part of my ancestry. It's there. It's important to me. Like, tell me about like reconciling, like who counts?
I think that it's very nuanced to like navigate that. It really depends on your situation, right? And I always say this. A lot of people hear what I say and they jump to the conclusion, oh, you're saying that if I'm mixed race, to only solely claim myself as indigenous, right, and deny all my other racial groups if I'm mixed. I never say that. I always try to put it out there like, hey, I'm just saying that, if we look at the history, there has been 500 years of de-Indianization. There has not been 500 years of denying European ancestry. There's been the exact opposite, promoting European ancestry, right? So for me, that's one thing to acknowledge. But going back to your question, it depends on how far you want to take this. And I think it depends if you're really serious about reconnecting, right? Trying to find what nation you may descend from and trying to learn of the people you come from. For me, that journey has been it's been a roller coaster ride, right? And I think that what you're saying, echoing your point about in the community, it can be kind of weird to navigate because you have people who are like, oh, you're too white, or oh, you're too this or that, right? You didn't grow up in the community. But I
For
think
sure, yeah.
that because there's such little Indian education on de-Indianization, right? And colonization as a whole and how it's impacted our identity, that we need to have more empathy. And I think that's my opinion. That's my take. We have to have more empathy, and we have to create more of a space for people to be able to make mistakes, respectfully call out these mistakes, right? So they don't appropriate, etc., and they can learn about their heritage and properly reconnect. Because if we say that, hey, you don't know your nation, you may have a large amount of native roots and heritage, but you can't claim it. I believe you are perpetuating these projects of de-Indianization. I believe that you're perpetuating colonialism to a large degree, and you may think you're not, and I think a lot of our community falls into that, not all, but a lot. They don't understand that, the idea was to Latinize and Europeanize our entire, race as Native people. And I'd say for me, what I did was I had a closed adoption, so I wasn't able to legally find out about my people. Like all it said was you're native and Mexican. That's all my parents, my adoptive parents told me. They didn't tell me what nation, what specific nation or anything like that. It just said native and Mexican. And then I was kind of like, what, what is that? Like, what is it to be native? What is it to be Mexican? So for me, I was kind of left up to kind of put the pieces together myself. I wasn't raised within the culture myself. I was raised by two, white men. And for me, I just obsessed about getting into the books and learning about my people myself. I grew up in a primarily white town too. So it was kind of awkward for me. I couldn't really connect with them because I did face a lot of racism and prejudice growing up with my brother, right? So it was awkward. And I was being treated differently for the color of my skin, which was weird for me. And it alienated me. But a lot of people like to, in my belief, what I've seen is to kind of assimilate. But for me and my brother, it was like the exact opposite. It made us want to push back. So what we did was we learned about our roots. We did genealogy, right? My brother has a family tree. We started looking into that, and we were able to trace and find our biological family. And from there, we were able to, uh, and I made mistakes. There was like growing up, we said we must have been Apache, or he must have been Aztec, or he must have been right. And these were mistakes, but I was adopted, and it was a sealed adoption. But a lot of people like to demonize folks who are in that adopted state or in that state of lost identity, right? And for me, I just don't think that's really helpful to anyone, and I think it's not a good thing to do. And I found out that Gureme, which is an indigenous group in Sinaloa, they're really related to the Yaqui natives. We have like 85% the same language. Me and my brother are learning the language right now. So that's kind of my process at the moment. But also learning about this de-Indianization thing, putting it in perspective, and then articulating it as best as I can. And then sharing it with the world is what I'm trying to really put out there. Because, yeah, I was adopted, right? But then there's also the other layer of colonization and detribalization and de-Indianization, which puts another layer to the disconnection. You know what I'm
Right.
saying?
Oh,
So
yeah.
there's so many layers, but it pushed me. I would say being adopted really pushed me. Having a closed adoption especially pushed me to learn as much as I possibly could.
I learned a word from you. I'm probably going to butcher it. It was on one of your shorts. I think it was like blancamiento, like whitening. It reminded
Oh
me
yeah,
of something I learned called white passing, which was basically what people said my mom's grandmother did. Like married someone uh, who was Irish. And blancamiento sounded a lot like that.
yeah, the blanqueamiento, it literally translates in English to the whitening, right? The whitening of essentially your identity, how you speak, how you carry yourself. In Mexico, very similarly to the African community, African American community, there's colorism, right? I would break it down in this way. It's basically the Mexican, Latin American equivalent to colorism. But I would say in a more systemic, larger, because you have all of South America, all of Latin America really in there. It's not just one country, but it's many. And it's the idea basically that you need to hide your indigeneity, right? Or if you have African roots or your African roots, right? But because of the majority being largely of indigenous background, it mainly held that against, indigenous people. And for example, in a lot of Mexican families, there's this idea of para mejorar la raza, to better the race, right? A lot of and I get this knowledge from not only my own biological family, but also from talking to my friends who are from the Mexican community and also seeing it firsthand. There's this idea of para mejorar la raza, better the race. This is something that falls into that blanqueamiento, this ideology of trying to aspire towards whiteness to better and become more beautiful and smarter and more intelligent. This idea that to be indigenous or African or anything other than white is inherently inferior, has really been pushed largely on the Mexican people and largely on the Latino people. Sometimes, abuelos or abuelas will say, things like "Cásate con un güero para mejorar la raza," right? Marry the white man, better the race, right? And this idea is instilled in our community. And a lot of people, even with like little covert things, like if your kid comes out looking more white, right, or more native, the white baby will be a little bit more praised, right, and be like, oh my God, so cute, the blue eyes, blah blah blah, so beautiful. And then the darkening, the darker skinned one will be treated maybe not in the same type of way, right? So, the idea of blanqueamiento, but also in California, right? There's this idea that if you had any form of, indigenous ancestry, it's kind of poisoning your line, right? For example, in 1850, I believe, 1850, 1855, there was a law in California called the One-Fourth Indian Law, right? And you can look it up. You can see it for yourself. It's pretty ugly. Um, the idea was if you had one-fourth native ancestry, you'd be considered a full-blooded native. Essentially, you'd be just, having 25% native ancestry, you'd be considered full-blooded, and you could not testify in court against a white person, you know? And that's something that affected a lot of Mexicans and Mexican Americans. For example, one case of that would be Joaquin Murrieta. They say he's the inspiration for Zorro, right? And an extension, Batman. Real life character. He was also Yoremi Mile. So I was very interested as him learning about him growing up as a kid because we had that connection. But anyway, yeah, he was based on a mixed race indigenous man. His name was Joaquin Murrieta. And his story is it's a very sad one. During the gold rush in California, uh, basically he hit the jackpot. He found a bunch of gold, and he bought like really fancy racehorses, mules, etc. Got a big old house with his brother and his wife, and essentially during that time period, there's a lot of racism against Mexicans, indigenous people, and they sent these white gold miners. They essentially went over to his house. They raped his wife. They took his brother to town square and they beat him to death. And when he found out about this, he wanted to go to court. He didn't. Everyone thinks he just went straight vigilante mode and he wanted to go around killing and butchering these people who did this to, his family. But no, he wanted to take him to court. But because of this one-fourth Indian law, right? Mexicans, everyone, they knew. A lot of people like to think that, the governmental systems didn't know about indigeneity of Mexicans and whatnot. But the reality is at the time they did know. And because of the one-fourth Indian law, Joaquin Murrieta was not allowed to testify in court against these people who, murdered his brother and his wife. So, I think it's important to note that. And a lot of the time when they talk about this historical figure, Joaquin Murrieta, they leave out that fact. Like this guy wasn't just, not to say that, going through that wouldn't push you to the edge to do that. And especially at that time, in my opinion, rightfully so. But he did try the legal system. It's not like he just, went on a straight murder rampage mode. He was pushed to the limit in every angle. So yeah, it's important to note that history.
Like truly, our family would be the success story. Like nobody has connections to any of the native stuff except we have some food we still do, and we have some tools that we still have.
I guess going back to the casta system in Mexico, um, a lot of people think it was based on blood quantum solely, but it was also just based off your phenotype, right? So you could be majority indigenous, right? But because you have some European ancestry, you come out looking more white presenting, you would be considered a castizo, right? It's not always that people were just like, someone was with a pen and paper, just like writing down every little, no, it was largely based off of phenotype. And I think when we talk about the casta system, that's left out a lot. Like a lot of people don't, look at it that way, that someone can be predominantly indigenous and look more European, or someone can be predominantly, uh, European and look more indigenous, right? So it's just an interesting thing to point out as well.
Yeah, well, it's just it's not a scientific endeavor, really. It's just if you look too dark, if you look too X, Y, or
Exactly.
Z, you
Exactly.
know. So when we're talking about like the Mexican identity, you did some videos that I love so much, and I would love to include them as B-roll over this, where you were talking to people on the street. I think you're in California,
Yeah.
and you
I
were
was
like
in,
asking people like, how do you identify? And a lot of people say I grew up like first generation Mexican American or Hispanic or whatever. Uh, can you tell me how those conversations went and just kind of what you kept hearing over and over again?
yes. So a lot of my work, I have taken the streets a couple of times, just walking down Whittier Boulevard, also various places in East Los, some at the university, and it was pretty consistent. It was largely people were identifying as Hispanic or Latino. I have problems with those terms personally. Not to say that many of our people that not to say that many of our people don't have some form of European ancestry from Spain, but more so by the fact of it solely identifying only as just, extensions of Europe, Spain, and denying and dismissing our indigenous roots completely. It's not even part of Hispanic, that's from Spain. Latino is a true Latino is anyone from Italy, France, Portugal, Spain. That's a Latino. And I find that problem because it denies our indigeneity. And I think that what I was hearing a lot from this, I guess, whatever you want to call it, just going around this questionnaire, I was hearing a lot of people identify with this Hispanic, Latino, Latinx identity. And then I'd ask them and I try to break it down. I was curious, do they have any idea that they may be indigenous or have indigenous ancestry? Because I know it's controversial. I know some people don't want to identify as being native at all. Okay, fair enough. But do you even know that you have any indigenous ancestry? Like, if we look at the demographics here, right? The average Mexican has, you know, extremely, like, overwhelmingly a lot of indigenous, heritage, right?
Mm.
To know that our people have been, in my opinion, broken down to the point where they don't even know. A lot of our people, most of our people, from what even at university, right? They thought they were just from Spain, right? Extensions of Europe, and to me, that was heartbreaking. And I wanted to show the world that that was not the case. We are also indigenous people, in my opinion. That's my take. And I think we should reconnect and reclaim to that. Reclaim that is very
Absolutely.
important.
I love that you're
And
doing the language. Like I'm so impressed by that. I think like easier way to get into is like food. I feel like that's so important. And you did some videos. I felt like this was really relevant for Cinco de Mayo coming up. A lot of the food, like when I went to Louisiana, is like the tamales and stuff. And I'm like, hey, this is actually connected to the indigenous side. This is an
yeah,
indigenous food. And it kind of took me down a rabbit trail of the foods. So you've done a couple of videos and shorts on the foods. Can you tell me about some foods that we call like Mexican, but they're really indigenous foods?
yeah. It's like a massive amount of it is
Like all of it.
contributed to people, like all of it, really. Um, the tamale, it comes from the Nahuatl word tamale, Tamall, tamale, right? Or you have elote, right? Corn. Ilot comes from the Nahuatl word Ilot. And the list goes on and on. I could go tomato, even the word just tomato, tomat, right? They come from indigenous, and this is like ingrained in the very, the cuisine of our people that we call Hispanic, that we call Latino, is for me as an indigenous man, it's like it's like a slap in the face when we call it just, we call it Hispanic. We're calling our indigenous foods such an integral part of our culture. We're mislabeling due to colonialism, right? And I it doesn't rub me the right way. So that's why I made those videos. And
That's good.
it's important to acknowledge that and put it out there. You know, what else is there? Hmm.
I think you had tacos on there, which I was
Yeah,
like, did not know that one.
yeah, that's the Nahuatl. Even that is a Nahuatl word as well.
Oh,
Taco.
really?
It means in the middle because
Oh,
there's
wow.
food in the middle. Yeah, meat in the middle typically. And it's not to
Oh,
say that there wasn't any influence from outside. Like, some of the meats, from came from Spain as well. But like pretty much the core of what it is, like how it's made, it's it's indigenous. Indigenous.
mm,
What I call indigenous American.
mm,
And I think a lot of people they're like, hey, I know sometimes you use the word Native American, and that's very U.S., United States, arguably sometimes Canadian. But this is my take again, but the Americas is a continent, right? And when I say Native American or Indigenous American, I'm referring to the continent,
right.
right, of the Americas. So I'm referring to the indigenous people there.
Yeah, there's a lot of infighting, I feel like, in this realm, which is why I have been
Yeah.
really careful about I don't even know what to do really because it's like I know I didn't grow up with this culture. It's not my predominant culture. My predominant is my dad because my dad was 100% Southern Italian. That was my dad's side. But then I think about what you're saying, where there's this, the blancamiento, that like, improving the race in the sense of like, do we just go along with it and just say, well, it wasn't enough to count, I guess. Let's just forget that we have these roots. Or do we start preserving it maybe in a new way? Have you gone through the process of tribal enrollment? Is that something you care about? You don't care about? Like, how do you feel about all of that stuff?
Well, right now I am recognized by the Guasadapa Band of Yoreme in Sinaloa, Mexico. I have an elder who I've been working with. He's one of the head elders, Bernardo. Me and my brother, we've been learning a bit of the Yoronoki language, Yoreme. So there isn't really an enrollment system like in the United States, like on paper, but it's more of like just an acknowledgement. And
Hmm.
right now, I know with him, he acknowledges us as sons of the Yoreme nation from his words. But I myself, and this is a controversial take, I see myself as indigenous. If I wasn't recognized, say I wasn't recognized by the Yoreme or whatever nation I may be, I'm still going to acknowledge that I'm an indigenous person. Maybe I'd be respectful and I wouldn't appropriate and I'd say I'm detribalized or I'm trying to reconnect. I'm a reconnecting indigenous person. But I think that part right there, what I just said, needs to be more normalized. Okay. A lot of people think that tribal ID is authentic, that equates to an authentic indigenous status. And, I challenge that. I personally think that it's much more nuanced than that. And we have to be careful with that. There's because even with that, and I'm trying not to get too radical on you, but
Oh, you're good. No, you're good. I trust me. I'm always in hot water for the stuff I say. So you're fine. You're in good company.
okay, I believe it. I believe it. I like a lot of your stuff too, so you're not afraid to you know put down this. Anyway, yeah, it's very governmental, and for me, I as an indigenous person, I see that as like okay, so there's a colonial entity that kind of he's like our, he's Big Daddy, right? Older
Right.
brother looking over us, and he's determining, he's the official source of who is native and who isn't. That doesn't sit right with me, and I don't think any colonial government or entity has the right to tell us who is native and who isn't. That is up to each individual nation. So, I respect all takes. I have my own take, but that's mine. That's
Mm.
my 2 cents.
I think it's fantastic. I don't know if these are your words or like you've heard them somewhere else. Like a lot of the phrases you're saying are so good. I feel like you're talking about like being detribalized. Like even that changes the conversation of people who were
Yeah,
separated from their nations for different reasons, mostly not of their own choosing. And what happens to those descendants? And I don't know. It's complex, but I think you're doing a really beautiful job of leading that. What would you say to the rest of the people who we identify as Hispanic American or Mexican American, or even if we're really just Americans?
yeah.
How do we start that reconnecting journey to indigenous roots? What should we do?
I would say first thing is to take a breath, relax. You're not going to figure out everything at once. Trust me, I've been there. And it's just every time I rush the process, I feel like I go back several steps. It gets worse for me. But I think you got to, calm down, talk to your family. And I mean, really talk to your family. Like, oh, some people say, oh, well, I don't have, my mother, my aunt, or my father. Talk to second cousins, talk to third cousins, go down the rabbit hole of who you are, of where you come from, and try to really learn of your ancestors. Look at marriage records. And also, I would say that there's old timey Spanish, right? A lot of people be like, oh, yeah, well, it just says originale, right? Or it says, right? That's, those are like, it gets down to like the old, the old timey Spanish, you know, uh, I guess, words of what they're using to classify. You
Hmm.
need to be mindful of the terminologies that are being used because some of them mean indigenous, right? Whether it be originale or it means, there's other ones I'm just having a brain fart right now, but there's a lot
Yeah.
of different terms that you need to look out for. And I'll make, maybe I could give you a list or something, a PDF. I'm not sure, but we'll figure that out.
No, that's right. That's such a good point. I didn't think about that because, like, when I was doing the genealogy and I saw like they called someone a coyote, I didn't know what that meant. Like, I don't know what is that. But like unlocking that helped me to like kind of figure out, okay, now I need to follow these great grandparents and kind of like where are they from? Um, yeah, I think a lot of it's just how would you know that? How could it's it's nothing we talk about at all. So we have
exactly.
to
And
educate ourselves.
I think that this is very controversial, but I think that the detribalized people, whatever you want to call them, reconnecting, people get so up in arms about the semantics of all this, right? Of the terms of an already colonial language, foreign language. We could go, I mean, at the end of the day, yes, I acknowledge that Native American, Indigenous American, First Nation, all of these are, these are English. This is from a foreign entity. So right off the bat, these aren't going to be perfect, right? But these are just something we're using at the moment to work with where people are at. And I think people need to remember that too. People like to take things so personal these days, especially on the internet. And I get it, especially our indigenous community. We face so much trauma, colonization, genocide, you know, so much trauma. And to expect our people, and I'm trying to practice what I preach by having that empathy, at least on my end. I understand the need for protection. I understand the reserve, right? Why people might be reserved about those who are calling themselves detribalized, who are making these mistakes, who are kind of like you never saw them before, but they're trying to, I get that. I really do. But I believe that very similar to the Métis people. Have you heard of the Métis?
Yes, yeah, I have heard of them. Mhm.
They, I've been really kind of, you know, burying myself into learning about them because I feel like there's a similarity. I'm not going to say it's the same. There's massive differences, colossally massive differences. I'm not going to equate them as exactly the same, but I think there's a similar situation that could be built off from, the works of Louis Rael, one of the leaders who really shoehorned that, the creation of the Métis Nation. And this idea of these people who, they come from a largely French and indigenous, culture, this mergence of culture, and they created their own contemporary nation, right? And they fought for the right to be recognized. And now they have a place, and now they are seen as such. I think that hopefully in the future, something like that will emerge. And I'm not saying that this has to be rushed. I mean, we'd have, there's so much work to be done to even consider that on a really serious front. But to me, you know, something like that would be awesome. I will say the number one question I get from, the little following I have is always, how do I reconnect? What's the best genealogy sources? Blah, blah, blah. What do you recommend? What do you don't recommend? And it gets overwhelming because this is like consistent all the time. Always this question. Always. And I think that, what I hope one day, especially in places like Los Angeles and places of heavy quote unquote Mexican community, was that there be community centers, programs for children, programs for even adults, where this thing can be readily available. Because when you know about detribalization, de-Indianization, colonization, and the stripping away of our indigenous roots and heritage, I cannot accept letting those projects just be. That the Eurocentric identity being the main staple, denying and demonizing indigeneity as just the new norm, and that's going to be the way it is for our culture and community. I don't agree with that. So, I would hope programs would come of that.
I think your story is so beautiful and you're so open. And I think people really want to just see real people talking about stuff, not like all polished and it's made up. It's like, you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
see,
Like, I don't know. That's what I want. I want authenticity because we just don't get it anywhere anymore. So,
for real. And that's why I like your YouTube account because it is real. Um, I saw your video with Andrew, um, Jolivet.
mm.
He was dropping some real knowledge, and that one he was just real. I really appreciate. I've seen him here and there at some powwows. I don't really know him too well, but I heard him speak, and it's just he's good with his words, and he delivers his own truth in a very unique, cool way.
Oh
Uh,
yeah. Yeah. Yeah, oh, I feel so blessed to so many people. Like, I don't know. I think the big thing of reconnecting is you think there's a couple of mean people. There's just a couple with real loud voices, and you think everyone's going to be like that. And most of the people want you to come sit with them at the table. They do. They really do. And so I think that, like, just being willing to, like, reach out to someone and not anticipate them yelling at you. Because, like I said, most people have been so, like, they accept me more than I accept myself. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's
yeah,
beautiful.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
really cool.
It is, and I've noticed that too. Growing up in the Bay Area, there's a lot of Native Americans from the U.S. and they're very open armed, especially into their ceremonies and things like that. And uh, shout out to Tony Gonzalez. He helped me and my brother when we were, I guess, at the very start of our reconnecting journey. He'd invite us to Sweat Lodge, and there'd be natives from all around the Americas. It was, and I try to tread lightly on the pan-indigenous term because people think that I'm trying to mix everything together and just make it just one thing that I'm not. I understand there's diversity and unique indigenous peoples, practices, ways, etc. But I'm saying like in that Sweat Lodge, you had people from all across the Americas. You had people from Alaska. You had people from El Salvador. You had people from Mexico. You had people from the U.S., Canada, from Tawantinsuyu, Peru, right? And yet all of them just in there and they were just singing their ancient songs. And I couldn't help but see that there was similarity between all. And it was cool to see that we could all gather as Native people and just like learn from one another. And I felt a massive sense. And at that point, I was still in that closed adoption. I wasn't 18, I was 17. I would say don't listen to, a lot of people like to just bash and gatekeep. Just stick to what you know in your family. Your identity and your family history is so unique to you. I would not say to let some random stranger dictate your identity. That is sacred. That is so important. And learn it yourself. Break it down yourself because that's who you are. No one has the ability to control how you represent yourself.